It's time for the moment you've been waiting for. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Tsh, da, 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 da. Di, da, di, di, da, di, di, da, 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 da. Di, da, di, li, da, di, li, di, da. Di, da, di, li, di, da, di, li, 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 da, di, di, da, di, di, da, di, di, da. Preparing the Krabby Patty.
In Europe and European-influenced countries continued the long, elegant lines of the 1890s. Tall, stiff collars characterized the period, as do women's broad hats and full Gibson girl hairstyle. A new columnar silhouette introduced by Paris of the late decade signaled the approaching abandonment of the corset as the indisposable garment of fashionable women. The 1920s is the decade in which fashion entered the modern era. It was the decade in which women first abandoned the more restricting fabrics of the past years and began to wear more comfortable clothing, such as short skirts or trousers. Men also abandoned the highly formal daily attire and began to wear athletic clothes for the first time. The suits men wear today are still, for the most part,
Good night, sweetheart.
During World War II, the clothing was greatly influenced by rationing and limited quantities of fabric, threads, and needles, so the most popular look was a simple outfit, using these much in-demand resources as possible. When World War II ended, however, the fabrics came back into bloom. Women's dresses in particular exploded with excess fabric. Poofy petticoats and fabulous collars all made the best taffeta, nylon, rayon, wool, and leather in the brightest and boldest patterns and colors. The 1950s marked the rise in consumerism in America. The 1970s fashion, often called the Me Decade, began with the continuation of miniskirts, bell-bottoms, and the androgynous hippie look from the late 1960s, and eventually became one of the most iconic decades for fashion ever. Generally, the most famous silhouette of the mid and late 1970s for both genders was that of the tight top and loose on bottom. The 1970s also saw birth the indifferent, anti-conformist approach to fashion, which considered sweaters, t-shirts, jeans, and sneakers. The 1980 fashion had heavy emphasis on expensive clothes and fashion accessories. Apparel tended to be very bright and vivid in appearance. Women expressed an image of wealth and success through shiny costume jewelry such as large gold earrings, pearl necklaces, and clothing covered in sequins and diamonds. Punk fashion began as a reaction both against the hippie movement of the past decade and the materialist values of the current decade. The first half of the decade was relatively tame in comparison to the second half. The fashion in the 1990s was a mistake, was the genesis of a sweeping shift in the Western world, the beginning adaptation of tattoos, body piercings, aside from ear piercings, and a lesser extent of other forms of body modification, such as branding. Overall, the 1990s saw a return to the minimalist fashion of the 1950s and 70s, contrasted with the more elaborate fashion trends of the 1980s. Additionally, fashion trends throughout the decade recycled styles from previous decades, notably the 1950s, 60s, and 70s.
Didn't hurt, babe. That ain't no lie.
The 2000s fashion are often described as being a mashup, where trends saw the fusion of previous styles, global and ethnic clothing, as well as fashions of numerous music-based subcultures. Hip-hop fashion was generally more popular among the young people, followed by the unisex indie look in the later decade. Those 25 years of age and older adopted a dressy casual style, which was popular throughout the decade. 2015 has thus far been defined by the revival of the austerity period pieces of the 1980s, neon colors, and the unisex from the 1990s, and these have been influenced by the grunge and skater fashions. In the early 2010s, many mid and late 2000 fashion remained popular in Europe and other parts of the world, especially the indie pop look, which grew largely upon the elements of the 1970s garage rock and contemporary fashions due to grunge and Tumblr.
Why study the history of fashion? Well, fashion has been made an icon of pop culture since humans first began wearing clothes. Just by looking at clothes, we see different values within that culture. For example, modesty, or lack thereof, the pride and wealth in wanting to show it off, individual expression along with rebellious intentions, and so forth. Fashion is an art form because humans constantly change it. There is no such thing as one form of fashion. As we progress farther into the future, humans continuously break conformity to destroy one fashion trend and create another. Fashion is simply an aspect of history itself.
Yo, B, they ready. Let's go.
Feeling myself, I'm feeling myself, I'm feeling myself, I'm feeling myself.
Yeah, there's a reason I don't have hair.
Well, put it on.
Put it on right.
It works.
Show up to school like this.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
This is what it's like to have long hair. It's all scratchy and gross.
Oh.